This next part of the conference of the future of the book is also, as the 14th century French poet Guillaume de Machaut said, "Ma fin est mon commencement." And so the end of the history of the book, future of the book conference, segues into the New England Renaissance Conference, which officially begins now and continues all day tomorrow in this room. And I, along with my co-organizer, Jody Cranston from the Department of Art History in Boston University, are very pleased to welcome this new injection of people who came at the last minute who are attending now the first part of the Renaissance Conference and will be speaking tomorrow. It's my great pleasure to introduce Anne Blair, who is a distinguished professor and a MacArthur Fellow in the Department of History at Harvard University, or I should say Harvard College. Her areas of research include early modern France, early modern European intellectual and cultural history, the history of the book, and history of science. She received her PhD from Princeton University, where I believe you studied with Anthony Grafton. And her dissertation was on restaging Jean Baudin, and she also has published an enormous amount of works, and one of them that is in press seems so central to what we've been hearing today. It's entitled "Too Much to Know: Managing Scholarly Information Before the Modern Age," and it will appear from Yale University Press in September 2010. She is also the author of The Theater of Nature, Jean Baudin and Renaissance Science, in addition to many articles dealing with the history of the book. And the thing that particularly catches my eye is the idea of note-taking in pedagogy in the Renaissance. And it is on that topic that Professor Blair has chosen to speak. And so I ask you to join me in welcoming Anne Blair.
Thanks a lot. So I thought I would start by addressing some of the future of the book issues briefly. Those coming from that previous session talked about the impact of digital technologies on libraries and on publishing. And I'd suggest that the transitions that we're living through may open our eyes to practices that we generally have ignored, which are those of note-taking. Because we have so many new choices of hardware and software aids to note-taking. And of course, there are many of the classic methods. You can still buy index cards, although my department refuses to stock them at this point. It's not just a budget-cutting measure. This was before, as no longer in high demand. In other words, there are even more tools available than in the past. And I think that's one of the reasons I've been conscious of thinking about this and then using that to inform my historical research focused on the Renaissance in its broad perspective, so that's where most of my slides will be. But first, I'd just like to offer some general thoughts on what note-taking is. And it seems to me I use the mnemonic of the 4 S's, which are fundamental to note-taking. Summarizing from a source or selecting. You can either, in other words, paraphrase or quote directly. And then, of course, once you have this material, as you go along, you need to sort it somehow. And the typical way is to assign headings. That's the sort of early modern notion of a locus communis, a commonplace heading with it. But ultimately, we do that too, whether it's an index keyword or a library type heading. And of course, the problem is those headings change over time as you think of new things to get out of your source or of new topics you're interested in. So those headings are never stable. And finally, of course, storing these materials so you can find them again, which is what the headings are for. So in the big picture, those things are present wherever there's note-taking. And I'll start with Antiquity and come to the present. I think we're still doing, at least I think I'm still doing something that's descended from much older practices. There are some new features of what we do today. So since the 19th century, at least, there's a real concern about documenting your source and therefore recording it with care. My early modern subjects often did not do so. And then today it strikes me that we've got some good things and some bad things. On the one hand, we have all those new techniques, both for individual note-taking and for collective note-taking. I was recently apprised of a website which has notes taken by students in one of my Harvard courses that are online, and the idea is it's going to be a wiki, and people will contribute notes as they take the course, and of course they can read them and download them. And this is a not-for-profit endeavor, although the guy who runs it also has a tutoring service, which is for profit, so it's all, you know, in that nice web way, exploratory, and perhaps, in fact, not going to really, it turns out those notes are kind of, you know, there's a lot of PowerPoint bullet points, kind of hard to figure out what I must have said. So I don't know how useful it's actually going to be. But it's interesting to think that collective note-taking is a kind of note-taking, which, of course, the web was initially developed for. We think of CERN and so forth, these physicists, you know, in teams of 100 who all needed to be able to access the data. So in that sense, broadly speaking, the web started as a form of sharing notes. But then, of course, there's something rather worrisome, I think, about sort of cutting and pasting, the way we can have stuff and we can store more and more stuff. And it's sort of like the photocopy. Let's photocopy this in case we need it, and then, of course, we never read it. Now we can, you know, cut and paste it or PDF it and put it somewhere, and, of course, we may never read it either. So one of my points is that, you know, going through the brain is still a really important part of note-taking. So I would highly recommend we hang on to that as a tool, as a method. So if we talk about the big picture, so Antiquity is one of the places we first hear about note-taking, but we have basically no notes surviving from Antiquity, although some of the papyrus rolls buried under ash and sort of carbonized actually seem to have some reading notes as people discover how to unroll these scrolls and actually read them without destroying them as we go along. But so why do we have no notes from Antiquity? So the form on which you took notes in Antiquity is actually the original, the origin for the codex form. These are wax tablets, wooden boards marked with wax, and you can see bound at the spine. And there, I've got here is an example of a surviving wax tablet with the wax and an inscription. You see the teacher's handwriting, the student's handwriting, copying. The wax then could be you know, warmed up and the writing erased, and it could be used again. So it's very green, very ecological. However, from the historian's point of view, not so great, because basically nothing comes down. What does come down from Antiquity in a direct form is not much either, because the permanent medium was the papyrus roll, which tends to survive like this, leaving papyrologists lots of work trying to reconstruct and so forth. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved in very exceptional circumstances, are really a very precious example of texts in papyrus form that have come down to today. So the main way we have ancient text is because they were copied by early Christians onto a very durable medium, parchment, which is a form of animal skin. So it does great that way. But unfortunately, of all the ancient texts to copy, it's not really surprising that those early Christians weren't interested in Pliny's reading notes, for example. Right? So we have no one's working stuff. Perhaps not necessarily because they didn't take notes, but in any case because copying them over painstakingly at great expense of time, but also those animal hides are not cheap. It takes about 35 sheep to copy out a Bible in the Middle Ages. So you're going to be careful about what you copy, and notes are not one of the things. However, we have some indirect evidence, literary evidence, about note-taking in Antiquity, and here our hero is Pliny the Elder, author of the Natural Histories, in 38 books, and what we know as books in that way are volumina, that is the papyrus rolls, where there's a limited amount of stuff that'll fit on one, and so you divide your work into as many rolls as it takes to fit it all. So his nephew, Pliny the Younger, describes how his uncle was a tireless, studious person, always being read to while he ate, while he bathed, while he walked. Of course, this is a slave society where he's being read to by a literate slave. And then how he takes notes, I'm interested to, this is our paragraph, basically, that we have to work with. A shorthand writer with books and tablets, presumably those wax tablets, constantly attended him in his chariot while he's traveling. And that's why Pliny never walked, because then he couldn't be accompanied by his slave taking notes as easily. And by this extraordinary application, he found the time to write many volumes, by which I think he means the finished works, like the 38 books of natural history, which we do have, and probably about 60 volumes of other stuff. He lists at least 7 titles, none of which have come down to us. So in addition to the finished works, he also left 160 rolls, volumes, volumina, consisting of notes sorted by heading. And here the Latin is commentarii, and the classicists have gone over, what this means as opposed to annotationes and other forms of referring to notes, written on both sides at a very small character so that one might fairly reckon the number considerably more. So here we have our first abundant note taker, although we do not know what was in the notes. We can surmise that the natural histories are constructed around notes, and so we can work from the finished book. But unfortunately, that's, and from this passage. And Pliny goes on to say that, to tell that he heard his uncle say that when he was controller of the revenue in Spain, Larcius Licinus, sorry for the typo, offered him 400,000 sesterces for these manuscripts, and yet they were not quite so numerous then. But of course, did Pliny sell? No, right? Because he bequeathed them to his nephew. So the idea is that these notes have a potential commercial value. They have, of course, great personal value and value to the heirs, although Pliny the Younger, I don't know that he did much with them. In any case, this is a tremendous sum of money. It is basically, right, the property valuation of the equestrian class, a lower part, but this is a small elite that commands sums like this. So a large quantity of notes might have been considered very valuable in this period. Moving forward to the Middle Ages and the wonderful era of parchment when things actually still come down to us, so the 13th century is going to be my key moment here when we have, on the one hand, the production of scholastic manuscripts, and you notice a lot of features that probably seem familiar. This is Aristotle with commentary by Averroes, and where do you think the text is versus the commentary? Right? We've got double spacing for the text, single spacing for the commentary. And then we have two registers of notes in the margin, carefully lined to place them. And you have little pointing fingers. So these be added by readers, whereas these notes, these commentary, of course, is transmitted through tradition. Another thing that's very familiar to us is headings. So this is a title page moment. But inside the scholastic manuscript, you'd know what the book was you were reading and what book you're in, probably not what chapter, through headings at the top of the page. So this is an ordinated manuscript. It's actually quite consultable. And it's not at all a personal manuscript. It's performed for someone. And at the same time, we start to have autograph manuscripts. So these are private manuscripts. Thomas Aquinas' an example of his scriptura intelligibilis, unintelligible, and deservedly so. And in fact, so one of the ways that Thomas composed changed as a result, I think, partly of his unintelligible handwriting. This, in other words, is an early composition of his, which he wrote in his own hand, but basically, as soon as he gets to be a big Dominican, he commands the attention of 3 to 4 secretaries, including one Reginald, who tells us about Aquinas waking him up in the middle of the night to take dictation. And all of the secretaries are copying out books for him. So here is someone who's an abundant writer, there's no doubt about that, the Summa, but not, apparently, an abundant note-taker. Because I would make the argument that although oftentimes, no doubt, medieval notes were of a temporary kind taken on wax tablets or perhaps scraps of parchment, which are also very cheap, and then would be recycled or reused or thrown out, so we may have lost many notes that way. An autograph by Thomas Aquinas is treated like a relic within his lifetime, and if the man had kept abundant reading notes, I think we would know about it. At least at the level of having been told that these had been lost or something like that, because indeed his surviving autograph manuscripts have been parceled out and survive in various collections throughout Europe, sort of like relics. So there's a unique example where the fame of the author, I think, can lead to a reasonable conclusion that he didn't take notes. So what's new in the Renaissance, I would argue, is that the bottom is the new sense of utility to notes and to oneself, that notes are worth saving and collecting. Sometimes people refer to the example of Pliny the Elder. Most often, the pedagogues make a rational reconstruction that all great writers must have taken notes. So Jeremias Drexel, my top entry there, is definitely, he says, Thomas Aquinas must have taken notes. He wrote so many words, you cannot write many words without taking notes. And of course, his message to his students, the aurifodina, means the mine. And this is a mine that, unlike real mines that doesn't pay off, will always pay off. The mine is note-taking. No reading is good without note-taking. And once you take notes, you will forever have a treasure trove of good stuff to enhance your conversation and, of course, to enable you to write abundantly. That's his main message. If you want to write like Thomas Aquinas, you take notes. And he lists off all kinds of ancient medieval writers with zero historical evidence, I think, and a bunch of contemporaries of his, perhaps with better evidence. And he tells a story that reminds one of Pliny of Hermann Konring, a legal scholar in Germany, who apparently was approached by someone who wanted to buy his notes. But the deal fell through because it turns out he took notes in haste and not very well. So unfortunately, right, so we have again a failed deal. But still, this idea of the note collection is possibly valuable. Of course, one of the reasons we know about these notes is because they have come down to us. So starting in the 15th century, we start to have people's drafts and collections of reading notes. So Poliziano would be one example. I'll admit to not being an Italian specialist, and I look forward to your suggestions, but Guillaume Budet, of course, Joseph Scaliger, as studied by Tony Grafton. These guys leave dozens of volumes of manuscript notes, reading notes, drafts sometimes, but mainly notes in that first order of digesting your reading. So there's, of course, a preservation argument to be made that, first of all, these things are taken on paper. Paper facilitates note-taking. It's a much cheaper medium than parchment, and it's pretty durable, especially this good paper from this period. And what I would argue is there's also an attitude change, and that's what strikes me as so interesting about the Renaissance, is there's this desire to stockpile and to hoard it and to keep it. You take notes for a project. You don't destroy the notes when the project is done. You save them, and you heap them up, and you bequeath them. And your, students and heirs and so forth fight over them, and sometimes they try and, who is it? One of those guys complains that someone stole, was it some Vala notes, and publishes them, claiming them as his own. So, you can market them in various ways. The question is, what does the note-taker, the note-taker thinks they're of value, and the way the note-taker treats them has an impact on how the heirs treat them, and so on. So the long-term virtues are getting information out of the stuff. In other words, you take notes even though you're not sure why you'll use the notes. You store them anyways. And possibly for publication, which provides reputation more than income in this period, as today, of this academic kind. And then there's always the alluring possibility of sale, which, of course, I still have yet to find an actual successful sale of a live transmission from a note-taker to another person. So, kinds of notes. I'm going to break it into two kinds. On the one hand, annotations of printed text, and on the other hand, freestanding notes. And I'll mainly emphasize notes taken in pedagogical contexts by basically schoolboys or university students. But, of course, this note-taking practice translates into lifelong practices. So the first kind is annotations in printed books, and here's an example from my book on Jean Baudin's Theatrum Universi Naturae, annotations by Isaac Sommet. I'm sorry, it shows us how things have progressed. This is the photograph I used for publication of my book, and it really looks lousy compared to all the good stuff we've got now. But you can see how someone annotates in the margins. Oops, sorry. So he's pulling out words that I've printed out. Adamas. Here's adamas, diamond. Chrysocolla, whatever that is, some metal or whatever. Chrysocolla. So if you can't read notes, look at the text first. That's my main. Adamas cedit igni, and here it is. Adamas cedit igni, ignibus tamen cedit. There it is. It's just word for word, basically. Here's a little comment that's a bit different. It's pietas Bodini, saying, aha, here we see Baudin talking about reverence for God. So that's more of a personal judgment. But by and large, and the great expert on this is Bill Sherman, has a wonderful new book called Used Books. Note-taking is a process of indexing for yourself a book, flagging what you want to return to, sometimes making cross-references, making corrections, adding objections, and links to other things you found, cross-references within your own reading. But by and large, it's often boring. Here is the title page of this, and you can see how it's very illegible. Casaubon has pulled out by page number the best notes he's made. And here he has a wonderful one, 566, Joseph Scaliger Laus. So in other words, a doxographical tally of who is praised and who is criticized is another thing that Renaissance scholars love to do. And so Scaliger is Casaubon's buddy, and he's noticing, oh, my friend is praised here. It's like looking for yourself in the acknowledgments or the footnotes, and they're definitely doing that. So this is a grown-up annotating, obviously, but now let's talk about how you annotate a printed book, how you're taught to do it. This is a classic Sammelband, just a collection of published school texts from a Paris college in the 1560s, and these honestly seem to be very common. So some of these practices, I'll just, I think we're at the beginning of note-taking studies here. But so I have little pockets of information based on the places where I've found stuff. But for example, I think these practices are common in a lot of different places, although they vary by location, clearly. So there's a scholar Jürgen Leonhardt, at Tübingen, I think, has found something like 1,000 such manuscripts that I'm going to talk about from the 1520s in Leipzig. So it's very interesting to see that there be these moments. The 1560s and 70s in Paris, the Paris Collège, are generating a lot of these documents. So what they are, say, between 14 and 17 fascicles of printed classical texts, very bare, just the text, maybe a couple, summaries, paraphrases. Here is, Virgil's Eclogues, Book 4, I think. And the point of it is for the student to take notes in the margins with call words to the text, in addition to an interlinear Latin paraphrase. And these are notes of a kind that would be quite familiar to someone studying these texts today, glossing the grammar and the mythology. And here you see, so you kind of wonder how they do it. Do they do it on the fly or copied over neatly afterwards? You notice in this later page of the same note, there are no headings. The rubricated headings aren't there. See, which are drawn from the text. So I have the impression that this student probably is taking them in class, but then he goes over his notes and improves them by adding the headings with a different color ink. And here he's added a colophon, saying he took them under Professor Venegas, a Jesuit, in Paris. Okay, so now the freestanding note. That was notes on printed books, either stuff you're reading independently or stuff you're reading in class. And those are dictated, by the way, because Jürgen Leonhardt can show, he's got, I think, 8 copies of the same marginal annotations. So these are students in the same class. There's not much room for, hearing something different. There's a lot of control in the Renaissance classroom, as all the Renaissance specialists know well. So now I'm moving on to the freestanding notes. Notes taken from reading where you copy out instead of annotating something printed. So these are the passages that you're typically quoting from directly, or, and this is probably what these are, passage just lifted directly from, or possibly paraphrased. And this is a classic, a commonplace book. You can see it's got, this is actually, I meant to say, Théodore Tronchin. What is going on here? I don't have my headings. Oh, well, Théodore Tronchin, late 16th century Swiss. I did some of this work at the University of Geneva. And so here you see the heading Des motus. And so you can see blank space ready to accommodate more such headings. This is a slightly later Jean Daillet, mid-17th century, with more elaborate system where he's got his stuff is page numbered, and he's got A, B, C, as you know from large printed folios, to situate, and then he accompanies with an index where everything is indexed alphabetized by keyword, and then you've got, 89A to find that bit. So it's a very important job of classifying this work. I'm wondering if I am going to run into problems. I am going to run into problems here. Sorry about this, folks. I think I have another, I didn't open the right file. Let's see what I can do here. Or maybe that doesn't seem like it's a bad file, though, does it? Okay. Oh, this would be sad. Let me see what I can do. Maybe I have it in my trash or my untitled. That's what I usually call these things. Or if I overwrote it, what could I have done wrong? Untitled. What's this? Is that today? No. Okay, right. I have to drag it out. I don't know. October 28th. That's not today, though, is it? That's not today. Okay, guys. Sorry about this. Let's see what I can do. Hopefully, I don't know how I could have miscopied. Oh, well. If not, I will wing it with another talk. What did I do wrong? I am. I'm going to open a new file folder. Yeah.
You guys open Keynote your doc, your doc should.
Right. No, I'm trying to open another file. Yeah. note-taking BU, but it's probably going to be the same one. Oh, no, this is better. This is good. Ah, this is nice. Okay. Who knows what happened there? This isn't going to freak it out too badly to have two things running, is it? No. I've got tech support here, too. Okay, so rubricate his are missing. Okay. So here, right, this, I knew I was missing some stuff here. So the other kind of teaching note is a freestanding course. And these are either philosophy courses according to the curriculum, and some of them can be very beautifully done folio manuscripts. And what I also found by looking for student notes around the University of Paris in the early 17th century is how many courses, as someone like Paul Grendler has documented for 16th century Italy, are not about topics on a curriculum. They are extracurricular courses. Professors made extra money by teaching what students actually wanted to learn, not what the curriculum told them they should teach. So here is an example of a chorography or geography course, you know, in the Bibliothèque Municipale de Bourges, with a nice colophon, this Cosmography Selectiora by Domino Janus Cecilius Fry, and then 1629. And actually the way I came upon this, I compared it to a version that's printed, where two students got together after the professor's death and pooled their notes and print 6 of these extracurricular courses, which aren't labeled as extracurricular, by the way. They're just called opuscula. And they say that the very learned professor gave them in these colleges. And the printed version is basically identical, except for some oral misunderstandings, like Clavius becomes Labius, right? I don't know who Labius was, but Clavius is someone we know. So either one guy got it wrong, or they caught the mistake in the printing process. And so another very good demonstration that these courses are dictated. And so here we happen to have the manuscript of another guy in the class whose notes weren't used for the publication, or at least not acknowledged. So here's an example of a freestanding philosophy course. This is quite late, but like I said, I found some for early 17th century. This is Robert Chouet at the University of Geneva. So this is the title page, Syntagma Philosophiae, and you see that it's got a kind of book look to it. And then this is the inside with a proemium, and then there'll be chapters, and there'll be subchapters, and so forth. And often these books are printed after the professor's death. So the freestanding philosophy course, or extracurricular course. Here's a Harvard example of these courses, Morton's Physics. And this is an example, instead of being disseminated by dictation, as was common in Paris at least, here it's the tutor at Harvard College who provides the exemplar, brought from England, which the student copies over. So why are Harvard students copying textbooks? There are so few of them that printing them doesn't make any sense financially. And one of the arguments of my talk is that Renaissance pedagogy is about the exercise of writing out. Writing out is good for the mind, it's good for retention, it engraves in the memory, it slows you down, it makes you pay attention. So it's a good thing. And this practice goes until 1735. There are a few books, so Thomas Knowles and Lucia Zauka Knowles have studied this, looking at manuscripts at the American Antiquarian Society and Houghton. Interestingly, the title page is Physica, I think, but of course it's in English, which is a difference from continental teaching. And here I have to show you this stuff. This is another form of getting full text notes of a course, which of course is what our students want, isn't it? Now that we have video recording and so forth, they want full text notes. But of course, courses that aren't dictated are hard to take full text from. So this is an example, very late, from Halle, 1698, of note-taking in teams to record the full text of sermons by August Hermann Francke, who's this pietist who runs an orphanage teeming with well-trained boys who have to do what they're told. And evidently one of the things they're told to do is to work in teams to take down full text, really, of Francke's sermons. So one of the reasons, there are hundreds of volumes of Francke's sermons that look like this. This page is exceptional because it's got a little note, which basically says, we have a problem here. Decade 9 is defective. And so they've left a few blank spaces, but nothing like what they really should have left. And they have inserted a couple of slips saying, basically, we lost the notes. So we're giving you the notes we have, but it's not enough to make a whole sermon, make it fit together. And here, in addition to verbal description, we can see how it actually worked. You have people side by side who would elbow each other when they're done, taking as much of the sentence as they can before handing it off to the next guy. So each person has a slip, and they take one and then nudge along to the again. And I don't know, there's probably some kind of orchestration. So now everybody moves to two. And basically, when you line up these slips, you can create full sentences from A, this is A, and I have down to K. So that's, I think, 16 letters of the alphabet or something. So at least there are probably 16 people who generate slips like this, and then you can line up A's number 1 with B's number 1 and C's number 1 and so forth and get full text. The reason we know about this, in part, at least it came to my attention, was because one of Kant's lectures on anthropology was circulated in note form long before it was published. And reputedly, these full text versions of his lectures on anthropology were made by 3 students working in a team to take full text notes. So it's like Kinko's copies circulating the notes. So in other words, we've always been doing Finals Club wiki note-taking, maybe without realizing it. This is obviously an exceptional practice that seems to be very German, possibly even Prussian. But I'd be glad for other examples. And Hegel also, Hegel's lectures on the history of religion were made from Reinschriften and Mitschriften. These are the kinds of notes students take. So Mitschriften is the note you take in a rush. Reinschriften is the copying out of the notes. And he had his students, a couple of his students, give him their notes, and he apparently published from it, because people don't always produce their courses full text ahead of time, so they'll benefit from someone in the audience taking down the text for them. So that is how you can get freestanding full text courses. Either the guy dictates, that's the Paris 17th century model, or you copy, that's the Harvard College model, or you do this really fascinating team note-taking, the Prussian model. And pretty exceptional, probably. But basically the point is, right, you want to write. So here are some pedagogues talking about the act of writing aids the understanding, engraves things more profoundly in memory. Drexel, the same guy I mentioned earlier, Auri Fodina, writing, slows the process of reading, concentrates the attention. And I'd remind you of a much earlier example. This is quoted from Anne Moss's book on commonplaces. While we write, the mind is turned away from light or even vulgar thoughts, right? How do you keep adolescent boys, thinking about the right things? Have them write. Keep them busy writing. So this is a taste of Renaissance pedagogy. Now I'd like to offer some examples of note-taking from reading, which is less controlled because, you're not dictating something. But nonetheless, so normally most of our reading notes are by adults in uncontrolled settings. But here I'm using the work of Gilbert Hess, published in this recent volume among other places, who has found a wonderful example of notes of a child. And it's not any old child, Augustus of Braunschweig-Lüneburg, who goes on to found the Herzog August Bibliothek, what is now the Herzog August Bibliothek in Wolfenbüttel, and of course a pack rat. So he had his own notebooks, and they are in the library, and therefore we can still read them. So it's a very unusual story of saving your childhood notes, basically. Because otherwise, I think those Ammelbänder survive because they're printed books, which people have valued and cataloged and so forth, and the notes are in them because they happen to be in the printed book. But these kinds of notes, people would tend to, student notes would tend to not be valued. But so here we see the processes exactly following, really, the advice of the Jesuit Francesco Sacchini, although we're talking about a Lutheran context. So I'm saying this is really a pan-European sense of humanist pedagogy that spans both religions or even Calvinism. So first of all, you read the book and you underline it. This is Cicero De Officiis, and here we see some underlining. Next, you copy out the good bits, as in the bits you underlined, and here we have 2 notebooks. First, we have the Sentenzensammlung, the things you encountered in the order in which you read them, copied out just under Cicero. Cicero, idem, 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 numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, and these little quotations. It's very neat, it's very long, and it's got a lot of good stuff. It's not wildly usable, because, you have to remember, you have to know you want Cicero to use it. This is the next step, which is much more useful, the loci communes, where you choose stuff from the Sentenzensammlung, so these are second-order notes, and there are other passages that are not in the Sentenzensammlung, and you copy them again under headings, and here's Sapientia, but you can see how it gets very messy because you run out of space, you want to add something else in, and so forth. The headings are ordered alphabetically, typically. Here's another heading with eruditio, where he didn't have as much stuff, so he has white space left. So this is your typical commonplace book problem of gauging how much space you want. So this is the double note-taking recommended by Francesco Sattini. You write it down once in the order of appearance, you copy it out again under headings. Once you've decided what heading to use it under, you have some time for reflection. You might copy it out under multiple headings, and then you find yourself copying and copying and copying. And Sacchini also says he envisions reading not very much, but very intently, and having your notebook with you so you can read it at all idle moments. And basically, you're going to be learning it by heart. So note-taking is an aid to memory in that you're going to master the stuff so well, you don't actually need to consult your notes. That's one model. The other model is the bulk note-taking. Okay, this is where I knew I had a problem when I got to that too fast. So here's Théodore Tronchin, clearly an adult bulk note-taker. This is the kind of note-taking where you're not going to be reading it again, and in fact, you need an index to find what you've read before. This sounds more like me, right? If you've taken a note on a book you've already read, it's kind of disappointing, and you realize it sounds familiar, and then you go looking in your files, and oh, I actually already have some notes on this book. Anyways, that's what the index is for. I have a few more examples. I don't want to tax your patience too much. Of another way of note-taking, which is note-taking on slips, which is quite unusual in the early modern period, and I think primarily used by what I call bulk compilers, who are one of the objects of this recent book that Victor was mentioning. And you take notes on slips because they can be rearranged. They can, if this one is keyed here, you can see this is a librarian's numbering system. This is a numbering system from within the note-taking system. It's got a head word, and it's got, these are notes used for Theodor Zwinger's Theatrum Humanae Vitae. Another slip that survives refers to, they refer to each other. This is a form of, I think, Ravisius 1 out of 61, or in other words, I think it's a method of finding your place in a book that would be edition non-specific that Locke describes, where you note the whole number of pages of the book and the page on which the passage you're interested in is, so that if you're working from an edition that has twice as many pages, you can double the page number of the goodies that you're looking for. It's an attempt to have a less layout-dependent form of reference. What you do with these slips is, I've never seen this done, this is in Vincent Placius's advice book on note-taking, where he says you should take notes on slips. The usual reason not to take notes on slips is they blow away, they get disordered, this is very bad. The only reason to have slips is to glue them into something so they stay there. But Placius talks about how you can bind them, or this is the note closet that he describes making for his own use, and we think that Leibniz had such a closet, although it does not survive in his work as librarian at Hanover. And it's actually based on a 1640 manuscript by Thomas Harrison, recently studied by Noel Malcolm. So the idea is that the closet is made of these sticks, and you see you have room for, I think he says like 10,000 headings. You can write a heading on each of these little white lead pads, and on the reverse is a hook, and your notes on slips can go on the hook. And so he talks about how wonderful this is for collective note-taking. People can pool their notes together. People can remove notes without your having to part with your notebook, which is, of course, a very dangerous thing. You can't share a notebook. So the closet is a great solution to collective note-taking. It's the top-of-the-line technology. So just in concluding, I want to hear your comments. There are many ways to take notes, now as then, and even early modern pedagogues, rigid as they were about many things, acknowledge that there are many ways of taking notes. And the most important thing is to take notes. So even if you don't like my method of taking notes, that's okay. You can go off and take notes the way you want to. But I think one of the things we still need to be doing is finding ways to concentrate our own and our students' attention, selecting with care, capturing the source and a record of its original context, which of course the early moderns weren't so good at, and then sorting thoughtfully, both about what we want to use it for now and in such a way as we might be able to retrieve it later without being sure exactly what we'd be looking for later. And ideally to leave a trace in your mind as well as in your storehouse of notes. Thanks.
We certainly have time for a few questions. This is fascinating because it represents an activity that all of us are engaged in all the time, and the history of that activity opens things out into so many different ways. And I'll just maybe ask the first question. Can you look at, one of the things that's fascinating about note-taking is if you can gauge, those points when the uncritical acceptance of authority moves towards a much more critical, way of what, and I suppose it depends on who is taking the note, and whether it's a student or whether it's a scribe, or some other kind of person, or whether the person was a member of royalty, or how old and how young. But can you gauge those kinds of things, especially during the early 16th century?
Right, that's a good question. And there's one kind of note, since these are pedagogical notes principally, that I haven't talked about is sort of the thoughts notes, the pensée, Pascal's pensée kind of thing, which are notes that, he meant to use toward a book, which are in slips of paper, bundled under headings, and a complete mess if you look at what they look like. It's a lot of interpretive activity going on into not just ordering the stuff, but just figuring out what words go where. And I think there's an interesting just denial. You look online for images of Pascal's pensée, and there are none to be had, which is kind of weird because it's very unsettling to actually see. And I do have one well, I don't know if I'll mess with it, but anyways, it's very messy what Pascal's notes look like. So there's someone who is not so much copying, but thinking. And the commonplace book ultimately, often in the 18th century, often does refer to a diary of your thoughts, rather than just recordings pretty slavishly from a source. But even the 16th century authors talk about, in the commonplace book, you're going to not just copy, but you're also going to add observations from travel, for example. You should always take notes while traveling. So they're full of, keep you busy and keep you writing and be diligent. So I don't find, and of course there is judicium. I mean, judicium goes into the selecting of what you put in. And Drexel and Sacchini, those Jesuit pedagogues who are the earliest explicit advice givers on note-taking, mock the people who just, accumulate so much they can't do anything, like the guy who spent, 20 years commenting on Isaiah and never, got anywhere. So, of course, that's bad. Too much is also bad. So there's a balance, a middle way. And there, it's interesting to see how many, I thought about, for example, how many headings should you have? I don't know if you've noticed when you go into, I love to use subject headings in library catalogs to find other books that would be of interest. Isn't it annoying when there's a book that has a subject heading? Oh, it's cool. It's like, France, gender, and da-da-da-da-da. You click on just exactly what you want, and there's that one book. It's the only one in the category. It's like, not so helpful as a category, right? You want a category that's big enough to have 2, 3, right? On the other hand, you do France history, you have, we can't display all your hits. You have too many hits. That's also a problem category. So there's too many and too small. And so some note takers like John Locke talks about what's the right number of categories. You don't want to have, and Erasmus has some words on how many categories. He actually indexes his own adages, 257 commonplace headings. So there's a scale for you. That's what he thinks is right. But I suppose I haven't really, so the answer is, I think it's a constant, how the Renaissance scholars are constantly mixing their personal opinion and the stuff that they're retrieving. And of course, we don't see what people use the notes for. So for example, Montaigne is a nice example. We don't really have any notebooks of his. We do have some annotated books. And, he's clearly someone who puts headings in the margin. And Francis Goyer has showed how he changes the headings in the margin. And then what he does with this stuff is so different. Right, he manages to, make an essay from, of the lame, from, how we thought the calendar change would be a big deal and it wasn't, and how we think that lame women are better in bed but they aren't. It's like, whoa, how did he get from that to that? That is of the lame. That's the first and the last example. And so that's his mind. It's taking these different examples and stringing them together in this wildly original way, right? So is that, on the other hand, each of the examples has come from a place that came from his readings, and yet how he put them together was completely new.
It's probably the Guccione Codex or something. Okay, yes. Can you go to the microphone? I think that's. Sorry, I didn't. I guess some entitlement.
This is actually an example from the 19th century. I was looking into historians' notes before the Commune of Paris, because a lot of records were destroyed after the Franco-Prussian War, trying to find out some information. And so I boxes of 19th century historians' notes who either they or the descendants had deposited. And one historian of Orléans had in French, "I wish I'd finished the book." So this was a great lesson to me, not to wait for the book, but to get articles out there with whatever you find in the archives so that in case the book never comes or you're deceased or you're absent-minded. It was a great, great lesson to me, all those stale notes sitting in those boxes.
Right. They're a very good lesson to us all. And then you know what's going to happen. We were just talking about platforms. And, you know, we may be convinced that Google Books and digitized books are going to make it into the next platform, But you bet your notes, you know, some of mine are in WordPerfect 4.2, and I had to get them into 5.1, and now I have to get them into Word. And if I don't do that now, well, I still can.
That's right.
You know, they're going to be lost. So no one, just as no one was copying those papyrus notes of Pliny's, no one's going to copy your outdated software onto the next medium. You know,
that's a good lesson. I didn't even think of that.
Right. So that's another good reason to
mine
publish.
are in 5.1.
Right. Long live 5.1.
You'd commented on the paucity of cases where you knew what the notes had been used for, what the end product was. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to mention that in the British Library, in the Royal Collection, there are a number of volumes annotated by Henry VIII, used in the construction of his papers leading to his divorce, the Act of Supremacy, that have his comments on all sorts of things, including a fair number of curses. No, this is not right. And
That's
a few
terrific.
things
Has that
which
been
I
studied?
can't say in polite conversation.
Are you studying that?
I was looking at that this past summer.
You know, one of the Polianteias, which is the kind of volume, so my book in press is about reference books, and I got into note-taking because how do you make a huge book? You have to have notes to spill into it. And why does anybody want to buy a huge book? Well, because everybody wants to have their treasury of notes. And what if, you know, they were too lazy or they didn't bother or whatever, and now they can buy a treasury of ready-made notes. So actually one of the books I looked at was a Polianteia, which is one of these early collections of quotations of, you know, biblical and ancient authors, and one of them is annotated by Henry VIII, and you're absolutely right. Lex matrimonium papa. It's like heavily, well, it's not very verbal. It's more, you know, ... and wiggle, 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 and stuff like that. But you can see he's like busy cranking it out. So, yeah, thank you.
I was going to say, what's interesting is that the archiving and, you know, of notes and the collecting of notes has become, you know, very, very important, you know, in sort of, you know, modern pedagogical you know, initiatives. For example, you know, we want more and more students to tell us about their process. We want more and more students to tell us how they're learning, you know, and so there's all this kinds of assessment and things like, you know, we want. I mean, we don't really care about your finished product that much anymore. Right. I mean, what we want to see is what you're doing with your material. So publish your notes, publish your correspondence, but anything that you've got, draft.
Is that partly driven by fear of the sort of more ready access to other people's work? Plagiarism and stuff. So if you see process, I get it that some of these companies will not just sell you a finished paper, but they will also sell you an outline and notes and so forth to go with it. So you can get the whole package.
No, I mean...
That might be a bit cynical, sorry.
Could be. I mean, that's really not my reason for it. I mean, I just like, you know, just like that.
Yeah.
Like
I think we are becoming, as, you know, material culture has become an interest and process. Yeah, looking at also the hidden parts, the things that don't get acknowledged. So, for example, the helpers, the fact that, you know, Montaigne probably dictated some of his stuff, including to a guy who ran off with an essay on armor. This is George Hoffman's work, Montaigne's career. All kinds of goodies about intellectual work is not as solitary, you know, communion with the great minds as we have envisioned it. But there's a host of people who help. And so one of the kinds of help that bulk compilers get is from the people who cut physically from printed books or from notes and then glue in the right place. And guess who gets acknowledged by Ulisse Alderandi for that? His wife, his dear wife, for gluing. So there you go.
I mean, what we really wanted people to, you know, have, you know, the notes, you know, after reading Machiavelli's, you know, discourses and things like that. I mean, but, you know, we have commentaries on things like that, but we just don't have, you know, a lot of this. I don't know. I mean, do we?
Well, Machiavelli's notes, I think we do have some. Ada Palmer at Harvard just finished a dissertation where she talked about Machiavelli's notes on Lucretius, and unlike basically every other Italian set of notes on Lucretius she found where they were all about the language and the Latin and so forth, Machiavelli was actually interested in the philosophy. But of course there's always room for more. that background stuff.
I was intrigued by those works of students that then become books later. And it happens in the 9th century as well. A lot of books are cooperative projects between the author and the first generation of teacher and the second generation of students. And with the invention of paper, there's intellectual property is becoming a problem. So did you find parallel texts, let's say, where the student Mitschriften or Reinschriften competed with the author's work? Or if there were no such books written by the author themselves, what were the issues of property of that, not of the mental text, but of the physical book? Did you find anything about that?
No, that's a great question. I mean, actually, from the Middle Ages, we have, so this is work, the reportaciones, which are notes from sermons, I think are the place you can observe it. So, say, for example, Bernard's sermons. Bernard parked a secretary in the audience to take down his notes, and then he would go over that and issue an authorized, publish a sermon. But there are sort of wildcat sermons, versions of the sermons, same sermons, running around because of people in the audience who also took notes. But those notes are really much more telegraphic notes, because sermons are delivered at normal speed, and then people choose what to write down. So it's interesting, sometimes some people chose the exempla and the sort of details, the telling anecdotes, versus some people basically took down a PowerPoint outline of the sermon and the main religious messages. And so you can end up with very different looking notes, as one would expect today from a lecture. From the early modern period, actually, the most common method is to wait for the guy to be dead. So there's no competition in that sense. And I don't know what the professor, expected. Actually, so Janus Cecilius Fry is one who publishes a few of his works in his lifetime, but then many of them are published posthumously. And when they are published posthumously, in the posthumous publication, you do get the previously published works gathered in. So the Opera Varia and the Opuscula Varia, the Opera Varia are previously published, and the Opuscula are not previously published, and the two are a set edited by the same guy. But I clearly feel that those particular students were kind of leveraging their contact with a great man to boost their own. This guy, for example, he gets elected to the Académie Française, and I can't figure out what he did other than editing his teacher's Latin stuff. He must, obviously, he was very well connected and so forth. But there's an example of great impact from having, been a literary agent after someone's death. So I haven't seen competition, although, is that the story of Vala? I should look in my notes to make sure it's correct. It's Aldous who, in a preface, complains about someone who had taken the dead man's notes and passed it off as his own. But that's, obviously, again, the guy's dead. So that's always easier to solve the property problems that way. Thank you.
Maybe we have time for one more question if there is. Sure, come on up. I mean, I don't even remember it at Berkeley. I don't think I took any notes. But of course, I went to Berkeley. I may not remember that I took any notes. So,
you got the 16th.
That's also possible.
Well, there are certain disciplines that are prone to note-taking, and I think historians are particularly prone to note-taking. I mean, my husband's a sort of physicist, computer scientist, and I believe him when he says he didn't take notes, because it's much more about sort of getting it and then remember. But then, he now regrets that he hasn't taken notes. I mean, there is a phenomenon as you accumulate stuff, it's harder and harder to, I tell my students, they're making it through a term paper. No problem. They'll remember where they put everything, and they'll even remember what they read. But, as you build a dissertation, and then as you go on from there, I think it's something we are likely to all experience.
Hi, I'm a student at Boston University. I'm a sophomore. I've noticed that with technology emerging, there's a lot of trends in note-taking that are different. So now you begin to see a lot of laptop use. I mean, I personally don't like laptops just because they make a lot of noise, but they're useful in the sense that, some of my friends, they take notes, and then when final comes, they're able to pull out their notes and, search through them and basically study better. I was just wondering what your take on how technology affects note-taking and maybe how it might help us nowadays, basically when we have to produce things based on those notes.
Right. Thank you. I think that's a question we all face. I know. That's why I work on note-taking. I'm really worried. I mean, of course, I'm at a new project here. I just finally finished this book, which had its notes in WordPerfect 5.1, indexed in a Word file, And now I realize, okay, I can start with a new set of notes. Obviously, the old ones I still want to have access to, and I'm definitely going to be cautious in deciding, of course, once you choose it, it's obsolete. That's one problem, and then you don't know who's going to be around, who's going to be the dominant player among all these notes. I do recommend to my students that they take notes on a computer. I think it has made me more cavalier with my paper notes, but I'm horrified at the single version of something that you just misplace. You can't remember where it is. And when it's, so now when I get a photocopy of this unique thing, I PDF it and I save it 5,000 different places. And you can be more redundant with your notes. You can copy them in multiple places at no cost, basically. So I think there are many virtues to computer note-taking. I appreciate that the laptop is a pain in class, and I didn't take any classes in the era when that was an option. And I regret, so I started taking notes basically with my dissertation, taking notes on computer. And that's really lucky. But I do think people who get to start graduate school or even an undergraduate, it's got even more virtues. So I think it's got to be the way of the future. The problem with index cards is they get misplaced. There's only one of them. You could photocopy them, of course, and so forth. I do have colleagues, though, who rearrange their index cards. I mean, the main thing is to do the work and to use your mind. So I don't want to be technologically deterministic about it. But I have to think that computer technology makes it possible to do some cool stuff. I mean, it creates new problems, of course. I mean, the typo is the killer for driving through your notes, looking for stuff. So especially since when you take notes, at least I, don't stop and correct all my typos. So I know that if I'm searching for Aristotle, I should probably also search for, any possible inversion of the two letters that I'm going to make. So there are pitfalls to the electronic methods, and that's why I think you want redundancy. So I use headwords in addition to, obviously, searching. You can search. I actually don't use searching. That's what WordPerfect 5.1 is not so good for. But, multiple files and stuff. So I use headwords, and I have an index file, commonplace index file by categories and then I'll say, oh, look in this note file for stuff on this, and look in that for stuff on that, which then grows. But then you have to go through that note file because it gets to be a complete mess. And you can get redundant categories you forgot. You'd already made a category, and you enter more. So at some points, you've got to sit down with your notes and appreciate them and see what you've got. So note-taking in itself it engages you in a time-consuming process of maintaining your notes. And I suppose the other method is to go with sans notes. But of course, that's a personality thing. I would be cautious in where you invest your energies in embracing new technologies. But I would recommend computer. I mean, so what I do is I have files for each book I take notes on, basically, that are then, so it looks like I can print them out if I want to, and I can mark up those printouts. Of course, then I've got to, I know those printouts are garbage. I mean, they're never going to survive my filing system. The filing system is actually on the laptop, which, of course, is tremendously powerful to take it around with you when you go to a conference. You can pull stuff up. So I think you should take the plunge, but don't go for every last. I don't know what do people use. What do people use? OneNote. There are all kinds of RefWorks. You can take notes online on these. Bibliographic note taking. I know Zotero. A lot of my graduate students are using that.
Well, you have MacArthur's. You probably have a scribe taking notes for you.
Well, actually, I'm a fan of taking your own notes. Isn't that the point?
Okay. Many thanks, Anne, for fascinating talk.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm glad I saved my thing in multiple copies.
Just remember that tomorrow is the New England Renaissance Conference here, and at the reception, which we invite you all to, please, you can meet some of the speakers. But I do want to issue a few acknowledgments here, and that is to the core curriculum, its director, David Eckel, who's responsible for having the idea for the Future of the Book Conference, and that made it easy for us to combine these two together. And his staff, particularly Zachary Boss, who was designed the poster, and in about 10 days made a substantial email list and publicity campaign to get the word out. And the fact that you're all here is testimony to so much to what Zachary and David Eckel have done. So thank you. Please join us for our reception.